Before we break for lunch, we're going to do something a little unusual here, which is try to get a portrait or at least a glimpse of one extraordinary New Orleans family, the Baquet family, which can trace its history here back a couple hundred years, I think, and try to get some sense of how or to what extent Katrina was kind of an inflection point in the life of that family. And I'm going to introduce you guys in terms of birth order here, just to keep things simple. So I'm going to start with Wayne Baquet, who's owned and operated numerous restaurants in New Orleans for a long time now. Currently, the owner of Lil Dizzy's. To his right, next, Dean Baquet, who's the executive editor of the New York Times. Full disclosure, my former boss. And to my immediate right is Terry Baquet, who is the editor of the print edition of the Times-Picayune. And as much as possible, we're going to hear them talking and be a conversation among the three of them. But Wayne, I'd love to start with you and the story of kind of how your family got into the restaurant business in the first place. My understanding is your parents took a big risk. Your father was working for the Postal Service, quit his job. They sold their house and invested all their money in the first restaurant. So what gave them the kind of confidence to do that?
My father loved the restaurant business. And the first restaurant in the family was in 1947. It was called Paul Gross Chicken Coop. Ada Baquet Gross was the person who basically set it up. That was his aunt. So during the day, he was a mail carrier, and at night, he ran the restaurant. And he got to a point where he just wanted to have his own restaurant. And he took a chance, and he sold our house on North Russia-Blave Street. And when he did, he bought a place called Goodfellas Bar, okay? And in Goodfellas Bar, served food, and we immediately, as a team, the family worked together to open up a restaurant and call it Eddie's, after him, of course. It was his dream. And the first cooks was my grandmother, my mother, my aunt. We didn't have any employees, and myself, and then help from my brothers, but a lot of them were too young at that time to be a great help. I didn't mean it like that, but yeah. So that's the way that story went down. So, and we had cubicles in the back. We had 4 little cubicles in the back, and I mean little cubicles in the back. I mean so small I can't. All 4 of them together was probably as big as the stage, you know. But we lived there. Everybody said you couldn't open up a restaurant in the 7th Ward because the 7th Ward was the mecca of Creole soul cooking. They were wrong. People in a little while was coming in there with their containers. I need some red beans, I need some greens, I need some fried chicken, and that's the way that story went down.
So what was it like growing up behind the shop like that? There were 5 of you and your parents, right? All crowded. And how did you divide up duties in the restaurant? What did each of you do?
He was too young. He did nothing.
Really? One of our brothers was married at the time, so he had a cubicle. And my mom and dad had a cubicle. And my grandmother had a cubicle. And all the rest of us had the other cubicle. That's how that worked. Just as, you know.
A cubicle is a room.
A room.
Yeah.
But did you guys do anything? What did you guys do to contribute to the
We used to clean it up. We used to.
Well, as time went on,
sweep
Eddie's was in
and
business for a long
mop
time.
it.
As time went on, Terry became an intricate part of working in the kitchen. Really and truly, on Friday and Saturdays, you couldn't get into Eddie's. And he was one of the people that was sweating in that kitchen. Dean, we kept him away from it.
Dean, can you talk a little bit about the neighborhood? You gave a speech at Loyola this spring in which you described a pretty intensely segregated upbringing. You said, I remember you saying you only ever went to the French Quarter even with your dad when he was going to buy cigarettes to restock the vending machine. Right. So what was that part of New Orleans like?
My New Orleans, and we're each slightly different generations, was was quite segregated. I grew up in Treme, and by the time I was a kid, the remaining white families had moved from Treme. And when we lived in the back of Eddie's, that was an all-black neighborhood, too. And in fact, until I went away to college, my only exposure to people who weren't black were the nuns and priests in grammar school and high school. And I had no knowledge of the Garden District until I was a teenager. In fact, I think my clearest recollection is that I didn't go uptown until I was a teenager for like a debate tournament at Loyola. So no, my New Orleans was very segregated. It's hard to imagine now, but I suspect most black New Orleanians of my generation would describe the same.
And when did the clientele at Eddie's begin to integrate? What period of the restaurant would that have been?
Wayne said in the back, and I think this is true, Richard Collin, who people who are old enough to remember Richard Collin, who was the restaurant critic for the New Orleans States Item, where I later worked, did a rave review that's actually collected in his book, which you can still find, in which he used to give beans for the quality of the food, and I think it was 3 beans, and he raved about the gumbo and the fried chicken, and I think that changed the clientele.
And what year would that have been approximately? Like
In the 70s.
Yeah.
in the 70s, so a few years into existence.
About mid-70s, yeah.
All right, let's skip forward to Katrina and talk about, each of you had very different experiences of the storm. Terry, maybe begin with you. You were here through the whole thing, right?
I was. Well, I was at the Howard Avenue office of the Times-Picayune, and we sort of watched it through the windows until a tree flew into the window, and we realized we shouldn't be watching this storm. We should be hunkered down somewhere. But yeah, we were. I was with folks at the newspaper who were covering the storm, and we stayed throughout.
And where were your temporary headquarters? Didn't you?
Afterwards, when we realized that the water was rising and the levees had breached, we jumped into Times-Picayune newspaper trucks, and we went to Baton Rouge. We settled. I think it was this business complex in Baton Rouge on the Airline Highway. And we actually left computers because we rushed out kind of fast. And we went there and everybody we bought new computers for everybody. And we set up shop in Baton Rouge. And I think a few of us were at the Manship School at LSU. And of course there was a staff of, I don't remember how many, who stayed here and covered the storm.
And you'd sent your family off before the storm, or when did the rest
Before
of the
the
family
storm.
evacuate?
Yeah, they went to Atlanta and actually stayed with Wayne's daughter for a few days.
So you want to pick up the story, Wayne?
Sure. My daughter moved out of New Orleans 2 weeks before the storm. She bought a house. She's married to a serviceman. And the storm was not supposed to hit New Orleans. It was supposed to hit Florida. So we really weren't worried about it. Me and my wife caught a plane to Atlanta. And we in Atlanta, and then the very next day, we are seeing on the news that this is a serious storm, Category 5, coming directly at New Orleans. And that's when I called my son and other family members and said, you need to get out, and you need to get out now. And as I was saying, talking about it earlier, our entire Baquet family, not cousins and stuff like that, but our entire direct link Baquet family all wound up in Atlanta. And about 17 of us stayed at my daughter's house. My mom, Terry's family, my kids, my grandkids, everybody was there. And then my brother, who was deceased, Eddie, his wife, and children and grandchildren, they came too, but they stayed we didn't have enough room for them, so they stayed in Conyers, maybe about a mile and a half away from where my daughter lived. And they didn't come back, and they don't plan on coming back.
How long did that period last where everybody was crowded in together?
It wasn't very long.
Not long.
It was a couple of months.
And how long was it before you came back?
I came back in a couple of months. I came back as early as I could. I needed to get back. I had an opportunity to open up a restaurant in Atlanta. Talking to my brother Terry, he said, "You're crazy, man. You be thinking about that." And I said, "You're right. I need to get back to my roots, get back to what I do. I have a restaurant, and I need to get back there and get it opened up."
Wow. And Dean, you were in L.A., right?
I was removed. I was in Northern California. I had driven my son, who was a competitive car racer, had a race, and because like all New Orleanians, I just assumed the storm wasn't going to be a big deal. So I drove up the Pacific Coast Highway so that he could race. Before he went out to the race, after the storm had passed, I called Jim Amos, who was the editor of the Picayune, as a close friend, and I said, "So is this thing going to be bad?" And he said, "It hit Mississippi, but it looks like New Orleans is going to be okay." So I went to the race with Ari, my son, came back to the hotel, turned on the television set, and at this point everybody realized the levees had broken and that the city was flooded, and just panicked, hopped in a car, and drove back to Los Angeles. And I never went back to New Orleans for almost a year. I didn't go back until my mother could go back.
And why not?
I think, first, I think it was painful. To be frank, I could do what I always did, which is rely on being a journalist to take advantage of the distance. I ran the LA Times' coverage of Katrina. At that point, I was the editor of the paper. And I think I used that as my excuse and didn't want to admit to myself that I just didn't want to see it. But a year later, when my mother was in Georgia, I visited her pretty regularly in Georgia, and my wife furnished the apartment for them. She went down a lot. But I wasn't ready to come back to New Orleans until she was ready to come back. So I came back when we moved her to the house that the three of us had rented for her near the fairgrounds.
What happened to her old place?
It was near the London Avenue Canal, so it was completely underwater, completely destroyed.
And you just let it go?
Yeah, there was just complete, there was nothing
It was
to.
unfixable.
What did you guys lose with the house?
In the house?
Yeah.
I think most importantly, our mother was the keeper of the photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And absolutely every photograph that we had. I have no childhood. There are no photographs of me until I'm much older. All my childhood photographs were in that house. All of us, right? Yeah.
The house was just gone.
One thing.
One thing's good about that is Dean was ugly
survived.
as a child.
One thing that survived, oddly enough, is when I came down, when we moved my mother, my wife and I went back to the house, which at this point was filled with mold. And my mother, unlike me, and I'm not sure about my brothers, was very, very religious. And we went into the house, and the only thing, the only image that had survived is she had a religious picture, one of those old sort of 1950s Christ pictures, that was hung high enough up so that there was some mold and mildew, but it survived.
It got wet, but it was
Right.
Right. I have it.
I know you do.
Wayne, how long did it take to get the restaurant reopened? What was it like coming back here and trying to get
Well,
a
I
business
was
going
blessed
when
in the
nobody
sen-
was here? Right?
Yeah, I was blessed in the sense that I also had a condo. My condo was destroyed on Bayou St. John, plenty of water. And I had a condo in the cotton mill on Poy Fair, and with a tenant. And the tenant left, and it was furnished, so I had a place to stay, which made it a lot easier. So I hurried up, got back, got contractors, and I lived there until I could, get it going. And it didn't take long, but it was an amazing experience because people from Baton Rouge and other parishes that were coming to check on their property was coming in groves. Lines around the block. We even had to stop the buffet because people would sit too long and eat too much, you know. So we, for a while there, for about 3 months, we stopped the buffet and said, look, you can get an entree, 2 sides, a gumbo, and a salad. That's it. You understand? So
Which restaurant was this?
Little Dizzy's.
It was.
On Esplanade and Robinson. So it was like every day people were coming in. Also, I just want to point out we had a lot of people that came from other cities that really came to help us rebuild. It was amazing. They would come every day in groups of 15 and 20, and they were rebuilding homes in the Lower Nine and all over the city in Gentilly. It was really something great.
Hey, you were one of the early places to
I got an award
reopen,
for that. I was one
right?
of the early places.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this earlier, Wayne, but how much of the family didn't come back?
Everybody's back except my daughter who lives there,
Yeah,
and
she
her
was down
family, her husband and 2 kids, and my brother's entire family is there. His wife, daughter, 2 sons, and maybe, I don't know, I have to count them, 4 or 5 grandchildren. They are all there. They found jobs, doing well. They like it in Conyers, and they visit, but they're not coming back.
It's probably confusing. We have, we're 4 boys now,
Right.
but we were 5 boys.
Right.
And our oldest brother, Edward Jr.,
Right.
died in 1994, and it's his family that
His family.
still lives in Atlanta.
I want to open up to the audience in a second, but a couple more quick questions. One is, why didn't either of you go into the restaurant business?
Because we couldn't.
It's too hard.
Smart. It's like
too
like
hard.
my kids. You know, they're not in the restaurant, but my grown kids are not in the restaurant business. I remember my son tried it for a little while, and by the way, I'm very proud of him. He's doing well. He's the president of a major company, and he tried it for a little while, and he said, "Daddy, this is too hard, man. I don't have a life." He said, "When everybody else is celebrating Easter, we're feeding them. When everybody else is celebrating Mother's Day, we're feeding them." He said, I said, "Give me the keys, man." Because I had a couple of different restaurants, and it was great that he got that out of his system.
I read a quote from you somewhere that it was some day that Dean dropped a bread pudding. You told him he needed to go into a different line of work.
That's a true story. I mean, my grandmother would make the bread pudding at our house. And we
Can
were
I leave now?
busy, and we were running out of bread pudding. So me and my brother Eddie said, let's call and tell them they got to get us some bread pudding there right away. These people are looking for bread pudding. So we called, and Dean drove over with the bread pudding. And when he got there, you know, he tripped and he slid, and the bread pudding went flying on the floor. And that's when I told you, what I told you? Man, stay away from this business. Please stay at Columbia. And he did great for himself. That's good.
How does being from here, and it's a question for the editors, but I guess also for the chef, being from New Orleans, how does it affect the way you think about the world, your news judgments, or
How does
your
what?
approach? How does it affect the way you think about the world? Dean, do you
I
have
think the world is really messed up. I really do. I just, every day I look at the things that's happening. I believe New Orleans is the greatest city in the world, greatest culture. We made a lot of mistakes. We got to get a hold of this crime problem, and to do that, we got to put trades back into school. We could have rebuilt our own city, you know. Back in the day, we had trades in high school, you know. We took them out, and trades are important. College is not for everybody. I think New Orleans is a blue city, a wonderful blue city that's trapped around a red state.
Dean, I'm going to let you follow Wayne.
It does affect, it has affected the way I think as a journalist. It makes me more, I think it makes me more responsive and thoughtful about cities. It makes me more open-minded as a journalist, because I think New Orleans is a place that invites open-mindedness because people are so different. I think it encourages me when I think about the whole of the world, to just be open-minded, whether it's, running coverage of Katrina or running coverage of the world. I just think it makes me see that the world is sort of a complicated place.
And I think what Dean said. but I live and work in the city, so
Yeah.
everything
is
we
this.
do is about the city, and I love New Orleans just like everybody else.
Let's take a couple questions, please.
I'm Bob Tannen. The New York Times has done extraordinary reporting about New Orleans and Louisiana over many years. Just last weekend, Sunday's edition, yesterday's edition, there were 3 major articles. The Baton Rouge Advocate has created a New Orleans edition. The best economic development tool I could think of would be a New Orleans edition of the New York Times.
It's sort of hard to do, but what I would say is that the New York Times has a deep commitment to New Orleans. We've kept a New Orleans bureau. My intention is to keep a New Orleans bureau, and to make sure that there's tremendous coverage of New Orleans and its place in the country in the paper, which I think we've done and will continue to do.
Please.
Hi, my name is Summer Solomon, and I'm with the Idea Village. I write and blog about entrepreneurship in New Orleans, and my question is for Dean Baquet. As a journalist, I was formerly with CNN in Atlanta and have been in the newsroom and heard many of the conversations around Katrina coverage. And my question for you is, as a native of New Orleans, how did that influence and guide you as a leader in the newsroom during the Katrina coverage? How did that influence you? You're guiding other journalists in the stories that they're telling, and were you able to sort of separate yourself from the story?
At the time of Katrina, I was editor of the LA Times, actually. It was before I became editor of the New York Times. And it was tremendously useful. For one thing, people were shocked by the scenes of the rooftops and the scenes of poverty in New Orleans. I think I was able to remind my staff that, in fact, they were getting a glimpse of urban America, and that, in fact, that was not a shock to people who knew and understood New Orleans. I think I was able to guide the newsroom to understand that they were getting a look at a larger urban problem in New Orleans that maybe the U.S. hadn't confronted in a long time. But by the same token, I think that I was able to make people understand that New Orleans was a city of neighborhoods. But I also think it was pretty clear early on in everybody's coverage, but I like to think in our coverage even earlier, that much of what happened in New Orleans was, of course, a natural disaster, but that a big chunk of what happened in New Orleans was the failure of government over generations. So it was, and then I guess last but not least, it certainly gave me a passion for the coverage. It certainly made me care deeply about the coverage to make sure that we stayed there for a long time and that we didn't do what a lot of media does and big disaster stories, which is disappear at a certain point. So it affected the way I looked at coverage a tremendous amount, and still does.
I hate to say it, but we have to leave it there and let everybody get something to eat. The plan is to reconvene here at 2 o'clock. There are books on the table outside. We've got a little bookstore, and I think Judith Roden and Gary Rivlin are going to be doing book signings of their respective books. Thank you three very, very much.